I am Dr. Ryan Luke, and the title of my session today is Adaptive Courseware in Support of Student Success. And I know that many people are familiar with adaptive courseware, and if you have any familiarity, you know that there are lots of things that we could talk about. How do we implement? How do we get people on board? What's the best way to get started? How do we choose the correct courseware? How do we redesign a course? What are all of these avenues that we take? And so I wanted to focus specifically on some things that I've looked at just to support student success, and how do we improve the outcomes for our students. But first of all, just to tell you who I am an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of Louisville. I also served for about 4 years as program director for adaptive learning while we had a grant to explore the efficacy of adaptive courseware at the University of Louisville. That grant has ended, and I'm still sort of serving in that role, but it is not a full-time position. And I was so excited about seeing how adaptive courseware was changing our students' lives and improving their outcomes that I really wanted to get back into the classroom and put into practice some of these things that I had worked with other faculty to implement. Let's see. The first question I have for you is, what is student success? I find that we all define this at different universities in different ways. So I just wanted to hear from the audience for a little bit about what is student success. How would you define your students being successful in your course? Passing, I think that's completely valid. Catherine, thank you. Anyone else? High grades. That's a great point, Mohammed. Some universities look at student success, moving them out of the lower grade levels into higher grade levels. Kevin, I love it. Learning the material, regardless of grade. Very difficult thing to measure, but I think to us educators, that's what matters the most. Retention of the subject matter. That's another great point. Yes, and that the material follows them into subsequent courses that your course served as a prerequisite for. I think those are all excellent points. So I put some of the most popular ones here that we've covered, but also, what about faculty success? Is that important? Is university success important? Can those things overlap? And can they all mean the same thing? So some things that we talked about with student success, we pointed out DFW rates, pass rates. I'm not sure I saw anybody mention the achievement gap, but we want to make sure students of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic status, different Pell eligibility, we want to make sure that they're all performing the same and have the same opportunity. Retention, not just retention of the material, but retention of the students. And then progression. Are they achieving additional credits for graduation? Then I put one on here that might be a little point of contention here, but satisfaction. Is it important to us that students are satisfied with the course that they took? Do we look at that in ways of how they respond to course evaluations? What about engagement? How much they've learned? Cultivating interest in our discipline and recruiting majors for that discipline. Are those also measures of success? So I also wanted to talk about faculty success because I asked the question, is there any overlap? And one of the things we want, frequent and substantive interaction with students. And this is specific to those teaching online or maybe in the last year where we've done remote teaching, because this is the requirement as set forth by the Department of Education. But frequent and substantive interaction with students, that would be successful faculty. Knowing more about student performance instantly, that would be helpful to us. Dynamic adjustments to material covered and instructional methods. We realize that every student in our class has mastered something. Can we quickly pivot to the next topic or are we bound by a specific schedule? Multiple modes of instruction. We know that each of our students, while we've debunked the theory of learning methods, we've also said that people do have a preference in the way of learning. So are we meeting the students where their needs are? Improving student success and outcomes. I see that as an overlap with student success. Early warnings and interventions. We are continually asked by administration and by our students to give them early warning or intervention. Differentiated instruction. What about, is it also successful to faculty to lower DFW rates, improve retention and progression? And then, is it important to us to consider student satisfaction? Are we always anti-course evaluation, or do we consider what feedback our students have for us to make the course more engaging? And I think, not everyone agrees with me. So my opinion is that faculty success really supports student success. And these things have a lot of overlap, and that we should be concerned about the feedback that our students give us in a course and how that plays out. But specifically, I want to talk today about how have we looked at improving student success through adaptive courseware. And in particular, at the University of Louisville, we have found adaptive courseware to do a few of these things. We have reduced our physics courses. We reduced DFW rates by 11 to 13%. And it has traditionally been as high as 56%. And we want to see more students successfully completing a course. Gen 103, 104, and I'm sorry for using our acronyms at University of Louisville, but this is our preliminary math class. So developmental mathematics, as it's been called in the past, but we have reduced those rates by 20% in the past 3 years. And now our success rate is consistently above 70%. And we want to see and continue to push that to a 90 to 95% success rate. Business statistics, we've reduced DFW rates. Our CIS courses, we've reduced by 10%. Differential equations, we use adaptive courseware there and reduced by 10%. Calculus and math. And you can see that a lot of the sciences or math classes are seeing the most results. And that's not to say that we have not done this in other courses, but since I'm specifically within the math department, these are what I had the greatest access to. But we've also seen in economics, psychology, biology, we've also seen that sections where we used adaptive courseware were performing better than sections that did not use courseware. And I present this in the way of, we had a lot of skepticism when we first started reviewing adaptive courseware in the beginning, because faculty were not entirely convinced that this would solve the problem. It looked like the next new shiny new object that we were going to try. And so we had a lot of pushback. We weren't concerned about what might be. We were looking at, well, this is working, so we don't need to change anything. And unfortunately, we still had some faculty that did not see the system as broken. So we had to do this culture change. And that's why we started looking at, well, there were some places where we couldn't completely implement adaptive courseware, and we looked at the sections side by side. We also showed that when we used adaptive courseware, we were able to close achievement gaps in early math courses. So in that introductory math course that I talked about, we had a 73.4% success rate for white students and 73.3% for students of color. And that's what we want to see. When we look at this statistically, we want to see that there's no difference in the performance of our white students and students of color. The other thing that we looked at is Pell eligibility. And we have also closed that achievement gap where students who were eligible for Pell Grants versus students who were not, we are looking at a 72.1 to a 72.4 achievement gap there that we've closed in on that course. Now we want to take that model and expand that to other courses that we see as problematic for our student population. One of the other things that we looked at is students in this specific gen ed class, where the introductory math class, what happened after they passed that math class? Were they able to retain that knowledge and successfully pass the next course that they went into? And the progression there is easy to follow, because both of those introductory math courses lead into a math class that gives you the credit required by our SACS accrediting. And we found that 70% of those students who passed those classes would go on to pass their next class. And additionally, 56% of those would earn a C or better. Now, we're looking at, did they get credit for the required math requirement? And yes, they did. And the other part is, can we improve the grade they get in the next course? And one of the things that seemed to be missing was, in that introductory math class, they were using adaptive courseware that was helping them pass, and then they were moving into a class that did not necessarily use adaptive courseware. So one of the things that we looked at is, well, how would this be affected if we also implement adaptive courseware into those next sequence of courses, which is what we've tried to do in the last 2 years. So now you might be asking, okay, we've seen these improvement and success, and you've talked about where some of the major successes were. And I could talk for a long time about small successes that we saw individually. I'm just trying to give the broad overview. But the important question is how? How is this done? And I want to put out some key questions that you should ask. And I'm hoping that my colleague Norma can also share a link to the implementation guide that was produced by Every Learner Everywhere, where there was a collaboration of several of us from several different universities that put together how we approached implementing adaptive courseware at the university level and at the department level. But the first thing I'm going to take, for example, I worked with our college algebra class. And this is when I went back to teaching full time. I took on college algebra, and I led the implementation team there to redesign and rework what we were doing to implement ALEX. So the first thing that I'm saying that we had to start with is, what is the goal, and how do I set up my course or program to achieve that goal? And unfortunately, the answer to this question can vary by faculty member. While we all might agree that the goal is to see our students successfully complete the course, that is the underlying goal. How we define that, or what that looks like for everyone at the table, could be different. So getting on the same page about what is the goal. And I'll tell you that we've had to do this culture change over the last 20 years, from being gatekeepers of holding certain people back until they met a standard, to being support role. And so I come from the philosophy that my job as a faculty member is to be in the support role. My hope is that all of my students successfully complete the course. I am not looking to withhold that from anyone. So when we get all on the same page about what our goal is, if we're trying to reduce the DFW rates or increase our success rates, we have to have that as our goal. And then we have to decide, what is it that we're going to do to the course or program so that we're set to achieve that goal? Then ask, what evidence-based teaching practices will support that goal, and how does courseware help? You know, some of the skepticism around courseware arrived from, we're just going to turn on courseware and let the students go through it, and it's going to teach them, and I'm being replaced as a faculty member. And that is absolutely not the case. I would ask, if that were the case, what does that say about our teaching anyway? I don't think that a computer can do a better job, But what I do think is that the computer can support our evidence-based teaching practices that we want to have. If we consider all the things that we've seen in John Hattie's work or other publications about what is helpful with learning and teaching, there's no way that a single faculty member could implement all of those things in the short time of one semester. However, if we're using something like adaptive courseware, we can support those efforts so that we have more time in class to do things that are beneficial for our students, such as having class time to actually look at experiments or real live scenarios. If we're using adaptive courseware outside of class to train, to teach some background foundational knowledge, then when we come to class, we can do more advanced ideas and getting hands-on approaches to problems. But another point in best practices is that we know time on task, allowing our students to work on things that we would consider homework or outside of the class traditionally, giving them some time to work as a group in the class or individually, while having the benefit of their instructor being there to answer questions or just being in a support guide role is absolutely helpful to their learning. And so one of the things that we found successful in that introductory math course was that we had students working in class in the adaptive courseware with an instructor on standby to help move them through. And when we got to points where the entire class was struggling on one topic, that was a breakout session that had to be gone over. So these are things that you should think about when you say, I'm considering adaptive courseware for my course. How do I put this in and what do I use? What about designing your course to improve learning and utilizing courseware to help you implement those evidence-based practices that you chose? So it's not that I'm just putting in the courseware and turning it on and letting my students go, but how do I build in these links so that they are directly working with my learning objectives? What about this section in my adaptive courseware is supporting my first learning objective? And how do I connect those things? And then I had Norma share the implementation guide. That's a good resource to use. And then my opinion is improving student engagement and outcomes may cause all of the other metrics to fall in place. So we talked about metrics for student success, faculty success, how they overlap, and how the university might also see that as successful. And my experience has shown that if we're using something to improve student engagement and produce better outcomes for them, all of these other metrics also improve. And specifically, I can state that using adaptive courseware in my own courses, my students actually love the opportunity that they have in using that courseware, and the feedback on course evaluations are overwhelmingly positive. So I'm not just seeing improvement in grades, but I'm seeing improvement in feedback. I'm seeing improvement in attendance and engagement. Now I'm running out of time, but I've mentioned some of this, and I want to talk about specifically, really quickly, the college algebra context that we use. We had to identify this question: am I the gatekeeper? Am I keeping students from passing, or am I here to make sure that all of my students pass? And then thinking about outcomes. If you're familiar with Wiggins and McTighe or D. Fink, they're always asking, what's the big dream? What's the big outcome at the finish of your course that you want to see your students achieve? And why does my student need to pass this class? In college algebra, is it absolutely necessary that they're able to find the square root of a negative number? Or is it that we're concerned about being able to process logically through a linear equation? Then thinking about your audience. And this is something that I address on the first day of class, because universities should not be a privileged system. And I think about, and I talk to my students as a whole, talking about, I know that some of you are working students. I know that some of you are single parents. Some of you are newlyweds. Some of you are adult learners, and some of you are distance learners. And each of those audiences have to be reached in a different way. So I am looking at, how do I use the adaptive courseware to reach them when they are available, and when is that accessible to them? I saw some questions in the last section about, how do we do tests? How do we prevent cheating? Is it comprehensive? Is it in person? And my philosophy on that is a lot different than some of my colleagues. And at the risk of being crucified, I'm going to say students will cheat. But is that the most important question? And I can tell you from my experience, if you set your course up in a way where they're not feeling like they have to cheat, or they're not encouraged to cheat, then you actually get more out of them on their own work. So I used tests. While I used a lockdown browser, I also allowed them to have open notes, because I wasn't interested on them memorizing all of the facts in algebra. I wanted them to be able to work the problems. I also don't use the video monitoring software, because I think that it disproportionately flags students of color. And I don't want that sort of thing going on. So I've created an environment where I don't want them searching Google, but they do have access to notes. And I find that I don't have as many situations where cheating is a problem. And if I'm looking at articles of their work where they have to produce their own work, then I can see that they're performing at the same level. I talked a little bit about homework using time on task in the course, and then other expectations. Is completion explicitly based on grades? Is it learning outcomes or completion of assignments? So one thing that I wanted to talk about with Alex is that in this group of people where we talked about implementing Alex in our courses with college algebra, we decided that if a student demonstrates 90% completion, and that's what I tell my students, but I actually relax that to about 85% at the end of the semester. If they complete 90% of the topics in Alex, I promise them at least a C. So they've successfully completed the course, because by completing the work in Alex, they have demonstrated that they can do the work. And I really like Alex as a platform, but I'm not trying to plug one particular platform here, because we've worked with several different vendors across the university, and they all have positive results for us. So now, because I'm completely out of time here, I wanted to give opportunity for question and answer. I'm going to stop and let Norma ask me some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luke. I encourage our audience to go ahead and submit any questions that you might have in the Q&A tab. We do have a question for you in terms of, you had some wonderful numbers that you were showing there in terms of the change in the DFW rates. Could you kind of elaborate on how that has impacted the campus and other departments in terms of possibly scaling the courseware at University of Louisville?
I think that's a great question that I'm excited to answer, because we had to have those successes to get anyone to start using adaptive courseware. It was using some of the success at our own university to talk to other departments to get faculty to consider trying it, because they throw up excuses like, well, they don't have the same type of students at that university, or we don't have the resources available that university has. And so once we started seeing even small successes and finding one faculty member, would you just give this a try for me? And being able to take those small successes and talk to other faculty members certainly helped us scale. In fact, in the third year, we exponentially deployed a lot of adaptive courseware.
And that's wonderful. So I'm assuming then, based on that, that it is helping to drive more of equity-minded education on your campus and helping to fulfill your all's equity missions?
Absolutely. And I think one of the best things for us, though, is that we came out and publicly stated we want to be an anti racist institution. And so now we are looking at all of our practices and how do we continue with those equity conversations in everything that we do.
So when you're adopting the courseware and adaptive learning, should you consider the students' evaluations as part of your high priorities?
I I I see the question as first priority. I'm not sure that it's the first priority because we're not just trying to be a business where it's consumer based. We are trying to do what's best for our students, and sometimes I would agree that students don't know what is best for them in the field. However, what I am saying is we can't ignore the student voice. And the reason is that we have to retain those students. It's a lot more expensive to recruit new students than it is to keep students that we already have. And it's not that we want them to be overjoyed with taking classes, but we do want them to find some level of satisfaction in the engagement and the way that the course was delivered. And what we see is that students complain when they have to sit and listen to someone for hours and hours and hours, and they never really get any hands-on learning, or they're not being talked to about active learning. They're just trying to write down everything someone says and memorize it. And so, but in classes where we used adaptive courseware, the students had lots of great things to say. And specifically, we followed up with questions. Would you suggest that your professor continue to use this courseware? And that is almost 90% of the time, yes, even from students who had a negative experience.
Well, thank you, Dr. Luke. It looks like we're running out of time. So once again, I want to thank you and our audience for participating. Wonderful that you were sharing your expertise and your experience with us. For our audience, you may now close this window and return to the main hall.